Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode we catch up to the 7th of September 1924. The body of Giacomo Matteotti, the Italian socialist leader murdered by Italian fascists, has been found. The International Conference to discuss the Dawes report has agreed to implement the report more or less in full. This means that the US will guarantee a loan to Germany and Germany will start paying reparations. France has also agreed to evacuate the Ruhr, which it occupied at the beginning of 1923. Most Frenchmen accept that the occupation was a failure, although Raymond Poincaré, Prime Minister at the time, is adamant that it was not. Britain and the Soviet Union have agreed a treaty. Part of it involves Britain guaranteeing a loan. This has generated a lot of controversy, with correspondents pointing out the bloodiness of the revolution and the cost to the Allies of the Bolsheviks withdrawing from the war in 1917. At the same time, the government has halted, the British government, has halted the prosecution of the editor of a communist newspaper who called on members of the armed forces to disobey orders. Boris Savinkov, a socialist revolutionary leader and supporter of the White forces in the Russian Civil War, has been convicted of fomenting counter-revolution and sentenced to death. The good news is that his sentence has subsequently been commuted to life imprisonment. The bad news is that his cell has a window. I should point out at this point that he was lured back to the Soviet Union by I was going to say KGB plot, but it was would have been the NKVD or whatever was the predecessor of it. The author of The Secret Agent and a whole bunch of other things, Joseph Conrad, has died. The Times obituary managed to make no mention of the Heart of Darkness, which, as I understand it, was the basis of the 1979 film Apocalypse Now. Yat Sen was the leader of the 1911 revolution in China that toppled the monarchy. Shortly afterwards he was deposed, but he has managed to create a power base in Canton in the south. A Times article tells us that his regime is mainly financed from the proceeds of opium and gambling. In Berlin there have been celebrations of the founding of the Weimar Republic. In an article on the Netherlands we learnt that the government debt tripled during the war, despite the fact that the Netherlands were neutral. In the 22nd of June episode, I mentioned that the British diplomatic agent to Mexico had been expelled after protesting about the expropriation of a British woman's farm in the country. The woman in question, a Mrs. Evans, has now been murdered. That was reported on the 5th of August. On the 18th came the news that her murderers had been convicted. Now, I know that justice was swift in those days, but that is something else. Lord Montague, promoter of the London-Liverpool motorway and an all-round friend of the motorist, has proposed that London's traffic problems could be solved by the building of a network of elevated highways. Some have suggested that this would be expensive, others that getting onto the highway would be difficult, but no one seems to have pointed out that they would be very ugly. And no one seems to have pointed out that the real problem is the lack of a market in road space. Slightly more practically, the Metropolitan Police, it was their responsibility in those days, have made Longacre, a road near Covent Garden, one way. It is still one way as I speak, although one way in the opposite direction. This month there has been a flood of criticism of the new Southern Railway timetable. It seems to have had an effect, with Southern Railway announcing that it will be revising the timetable for winter. There was some bad news for railways in general, in that there was a year-on-year decline in revenue for the month of May. This could be a sign of the general decline in railways, which would end up in the beaching cuts of the 1960s, or it could be a sign of fare control, or it could be a sign of deflation. Yes, they had such a thing in those days. One bit of good news is that the Hampstead line, nowadays known as the Northern Line, has been extended by 3 stations to Edgware. There's been a bus fire in Nuneaton which has killed 7 people. The fire started when the bus ran out of petrol, and the driver attempted to refill it from a tin. Buses were petrol-powered in those days, which I have long thought was a good thing, as they are quieter and less polluting. Diesel, however, is less likely to catch fire. The strike in the building industry has ended, but there is now a strike of porters at the Covent Garden fruit and vegetable market. A rent strike on Clydeside in Scotland is ongoing. The Democratic candidate for president, John Davis, has condemned the Ku Klux Klan. He said that If any organisation, no matter what it chooses to be called, whether Ku Klux Klan or by any other name, raises the standard of racial or religious prejudice or attempts to make racial origin or religious belief a test of fitness for public office, it does violence to the spirit of American institutions and must be condemned by all those who believe as I do in American ideals. A Democrat wanting different races to be treated the same. It'll never catch on. I should point out at this stage, and this is something I haven't scripted, that there was the British Association for the Advancement of Science met in Toronto, and one Professor Gregory was very much making the case for segregation, which I think by today's standards makes Mr. Davis a science denier. A film on the American War of Independence has been banned by the British Board of Film Censors. This is what the Times had to say. A film based on such a subject, the American War of Independence, would be calculated to cause bad relations between this country and America, especially in view of the number of Americans now in England. If there was at some time a golden age of freedom of speech, this wasn't it. I was surprised to read that in those days the Palace of Westminster would get 20,000 visitors a day, when Parliament was in recess. Nowadays, if you want a tour, you typically have to go through your Member of Parliament. In its preview of the new football season, the Times mentioned that there was going to be a crackdown on dissent. From now on, if a player shows dissent, he will be sent off. Anyway, that's all for this episode. I hope to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.